Welcome to a true spiritual adventure story like the world has never known with your host, Dr. James Yogadi Weldon. Good day, this is Dr. Jim Weldon speaking to you from Heavenly Mountain in Boone, North Carolina. Our community, which is dedicated to bridging the gap between all the major traditions of the world. And today we're going to continue our ongoing series of the story behind the greatest story ever told. Quite surprising how all of this began. And now in that story, we are at the point where Jesus has now returned home to his land, has begun his first year of his ministry, and is beginning to shake things up in that community. How such a thing is possible to know the details of Jesus' life, that is summarized really in my first two novels, my personal story. One of them is entitled How to Live an Enlightened Life. The second one is Adventures with the First World Teacher. And the third one is the first part of the backstory. And that shares how, as a child, the three wise men came to the area now known as Israel, met with his parents and told them that this is a very special child that needs to go to India to be trained. And so he left at about age 13 on the Black Sea, traveled by boat. That's what is shared in my third novel. Spent many years there from the age 13 to the early 30s. And after that time, he traveled back to home to begin his ministry. The purpose of this work is not in any sense to deny the story of Christianity, but to give a bigger picture of the life that he led. And quite simply, if we only knew 2.5 years of your life, would we be able to give a full reflection of your life as a whole? Of course not. And so what was recorded in the Bible really is only those 2.5 years where he returned home. What happened before and what happened after is one of the things that we'll be sharing here. And many years ago, I began work on this after a major expansion of awareness. I guess that's the best way to say it. I began to see in a superconscious state known as Turiya, above waking, dreaming, and sleeping, without my control at all, with no intent at all, scenes from the life of Jesus, as if I was walking through a 3D movie. And after a couple of days, I came out of that experience and said, I better start writing this down. And so the story continues, actually several decades later in my life, where I'm continuing to share the story, the most important part of the story, which became the great story that is told in the Bible. And I'm also going to share what happened afterwards. Because, of course, Jesus was a man in a body like any man. He didn't just disappear. There is a backstory. There is a story afterwards. But today, let's dive right into it. Quite simply, I've been doing this so long that I really can see those scenes, and I'm experiencing them every day. The next step, I really don't know what I'm going to be talking about the next day. I wondered for many years after Jesus got back to his homeland whether what I talked about was going to be in line with what is recorded in the Bible. Part of that is yes, and part of that is no, because I'm seeing scenes and events that, as far as I know, are never recorded there. And that's one of the things I'm going to do today. So let's begin the story behind the story. Jesus in his first year of his ministry back in his homeland. In the last episode, Jesus spoke at the temple and was rejected. And the power and energy that he expressed there, that he manifested there, began to give an idea of really what he was here for, to help raise the awareness, help eliminate the trauma, the suffering, the accumulation of sorrow in that part of the world, and open a door to living the divine life. And so after he left this location, he traveled a little bit more with some of his disciples. I talked in the last episode on how he found them. Honestly, he knew them because his state of awareness could actually see into the records of life and know that they had been with him in earlier times. Of course, it should be obvious to everybody that our life is much, much bigger than we could ever imagine. Remember, back then, they didn't even know that we were sitting on a planet. They didn't know what the stars were. They thought that the entire universe was comprised in their locality. Yes, they knew there was a few countries around them, but an idea of what the world and the universe was, they had absolutely no idea. And most of them were very, very simple people, just hoping to live a life free from the tyranny and the difficulties of eating and raising a family and doing some work that could support themselves. You know, after yesterday's session, I immediately started seeing scenes in my practices of meditation for over an hour, the details of some of those things that happened. And I'm going to be sharing one of those experiences about the healing that he was capable of doing. So he was a healer, and he was an individual that was dedicated to helping individuals with their day-to-day life and helping them carry that weight, if you will, take that weight on himself. And as he was passing through the town there, he saw a young girl, maybe at the age of 10 or so, pulling along a young boy, a couple of years younger, by a string that was tied on his wrist. And it became clear that he couldn't make his way around. It became clear that as she gave him a few simple sign symbols, that he couldn't hear. And as he was moving about, he mostly kept his eyes closed. And obviously something had happened that caused him a lot of trauma. Jesus was not only feeling the community, he was feeling what was going on in the minds and the hearts of those around him. And as he looked with great compassion upon this little girl and her brother, he could see that the child was literally seeing sparks, stars, if you will, in his head, as if he had been clubbed. If you've ever fallen and had a head injury, you know what that is like. I've got one up here that has a spot on my head where foolishly I was pulling on a bungee cord. Foolishly, I was pulling on a bungee cord, and the end of that stretched cord came loose and whacked me in the head. And I fell down and I did see stars. And so what had happened, he began to see the scenes that gave rise to the trauma of this young child. Not too long earlier, the child was traveling along the way and helping some of the Roman soldiers with simple tasks. He could take care of their horses. He could clean their armor. And so he was doing that simple kind of work, kind of like a stable boy, but on the street, on the highway as they traveled by. They would come by with their armor and their swords and say, "Take my horse. Feed him. I'm going for dinner." And so he did, in the hope that the end of that may be a few, coins he could receive for that work. And so he was caring for the horse, making sure that it was safe and not taken, because there were a lot of thieves about. It's very dangerous to take something from a Roman soldier. They were marked, and if you were caught, you would be killed almost instantly. There was no real justice from their actions. They could do pretty much whatever they wanted. And so as the soldier came back a little bit later, he was holding onto the horse, steadying it, and a fight had broken out nearby. And so the soldier, kind of like a policeman, took out his lance, took out his sword, and stepped into the middle of this to intervene. And literally one of the individuals got a sword in his side, right there, fell down to the ground, bleeding. The other one was clubbed, and he fell down. The soldiers weren't interested in the arguments. Their job was really to stop the fighting, to maintain peace, really. And so the child, trembling there, holding it, the soldier came back by, and with the shaft of the sword, the other side, not the sharp side, completely clubbed the child with that and cracked his skull, and he fell unconscious on the ground. Hit him in the side, and without care or concern, the soldier got up on his horse and off he went to the next confrontation, because they were always stepping in at any time. Anytime there was any violence at all, they were ready to jump right in the middle of that. And so the young boy was laying on the ground, really unconscious for some time. And everybody went about their work. And his older sister came by and saw him and dragged him literally out of the street. If he stayed on the ground, some cart would come by, other individuals on horses, he could be trampled very easily. He was still unconscious. And so he stayed that way for some time. And when he finally woke up, much later, he couldn't hear. And he continued to feel the trauma of that event in his head. Headaches, stars he couldn't see well. And so that was how this young boy was traumatized. And so in a few seconds, Jesus saw this entire scene play out in his awareness. How could he do that? Well, the truth is that the same soul exists in all bodies. There really aren't many souls. There's one soul, one life in this universe, in this planet. And it is going through all kinds of adventures in many ways. That soul truly is imperishable. Now we know a lot about quantum mechanics and physics that we didn't know. We know more about the universe, but still, even today, one of the things that I said in the last episode, take your finger or thumb and hold it up to the sky, daytime or nighttime, and think about for a moment how many thousands of galaxies are behind that one little section of the sky. We must admit that there's a lot that we don't know. And of course, in our age, we progressed in a lot of ways. You have no idea how this technology here works, really. I mean, you've got a computer and somehow it's been recorded on something somewhere. Somehow it's being projected into the ether, picked up by a satellite, transmitted all over the world. This conversation could be heard by 1 billion people or nobody. You don't really know how it works. Well, the field of awareness, the field of consciousness is like that, obviously on a much greater scale. And it is possible to access the memories, if you will, of the events, just like we access the internet. We type something on the keyboard, and no matter what we type, something will come up, but we can pick any country, really any locality, and our eyes and ears can go into that. Now, the benefit of the field of consciousness with elevated awareness is you can really see those events. Now, as I said in the last episode, you can see things at a certain point of our development. Whatever you bring into your mind, you can see, but it doesn't mean if it's true, doesn't mean it's accurate. So it can be 2% accurate, it can be 50% accurate, and a lot of it can be imagined. So anything that you imagine, you can see. One of the qualities of the divine life in the divine consciousness is that it is true. And the seeing with this kind of elevated consciousness that Jesus had was true. He was surprised about this. You see, it's only been a short time since he was christened, when he was baptized by John the Baptist, in this cosmic energy. They say the Holy Spirit. That's fine. You can choose that word. You could say the master consciousness. That's fine. You can use that word. Whatever idea you want, really came in and joined him. And he became the christened one. Jesus christened, Jesus Christ. Before that, he was Jesus, a man, like any man. Obviously, an elevated being, but one that really didn't have such capabilities. So these events that happened to this young child begin to pass through his awareness. In order to understand how he could begin to heal and understand what had happened here, You also need to recognize that our life is much, much, much bigger than we ever imagined. One of the principles that he begins to teach carefully is, as you sow, so shall you reap. So in other words, our actions result in a response from the universe. In the modern age, one of the principles of physics, basic physics, is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In the traditions of the East, which he was really trained, was the law of karma. Really, it's the same thing. And in a universe that is just, obviously, this young child, just a few years old, hadn't done anything in his present life to cause such a reaction. Who did he club? He couldn't have clubbed anybody. But in a few moments, Jesus also saw in an earlier time, he had also harmed a young child. That resulted in some damage, brain damage, hearing damage, seeing damage. And so that was the causal factor behind the event that happened. If there was no causal event before this, the universe is inherently unjust. We believe that the divine God is just. He's not some guy sitting up on a cloud, judging us. You did this, I'm going to punish you. That's really not an accurate representation of the life of the universe. Now, one of the things that Jesus came in to do was to take on the sins, as John the Baptist had said, here is the man that will take on the suffering and the sins of the world. Really, his locality was his world. They could do that. So think of it this way. We have a long history. We've been around really many times more than we could imagine. And in this evolutionary process, in this grand adventure, one of my early books that I wrote about this was called The Secret Journey to the Enlightened Mind. So we're all on a secret journey, a real drama in time and space. But essentially what we are as spirit really cannot be lessened, and nor can it be destroyed. It will be here, but it goes through many things based upon what we have done. So it's the balancing act of nature, if you will. So one of the things that Jesus had the ability to do, he didn't think about it, he didn't analyze it, was to accept some of the weight of this young child's past onto himself. And as he walked over to the little girl, she looked up at him and saw the most beautiful smile, the most wonderful blessing kindness that she had ever seen. And she was completely shocked by it. Even that someone would care, she was shocked. Because there were many beggars on the street, young and old. And also at this time, life was short. Any small illness could result in death. We didn't have the benefit of the medicines and the doctors that we have right now. The healers There were some, but we've grown in those skills too since then. And so he gently put out his hand and stroked her hair. And she burst into tears. Because the love around him was overwhelming. Her young heart felt that love and gave it to him, gave her the heavy weight. And so without thinking about it, really, he took a lot of that onto himself. And so the young boy was feeling that something was going on. Remember, he was tied by a string. She was holding on to that. And his eyes had been closed most of the time because it was just too painful even to look out. It isn't that he couldn't see, he still had vision, but opening his eyes literally was overwhelming to him. And so he peeked out and saw him there as well, peeked out, opened one eye, and saw his loved sister holding on to Jesus with her arms around him. And she pulled on that string and he kind of fell into his arms as well. So Jesus stooped down, smiling with great love at them both. And as this was going on, more details of their life and difficulties passed through his mind. He knew them. He was them. You see, that life, that awareness isn't living in the space that I'm different than all of this around me. If it is true, there is a divine life, a God, if you want to use that name, a vast, unbelievably munificent and adventurous and playful, all the qualities, consciousness that is taking us through this adventure story of our life. He could feel their trauma. He could feel their trauma and difficulty. And a great weight had been lifted off of her heart, really the same that happened in the temple just a little while ago. And she sat down and he put his hands on the side of the young boy's head. And the tingling energy he began to feel. You see, the body has doorways through which the divine energies flow with different characteristics. The energy that would flow through your heart region is love, can also be hate, and it also can be fear. The divine energy moves up and out, expansive, it moves up and out. And the energy that moves through the throat region can be gratitude, but also when it's moving in another direction, it can be grief. You know that when you feel grief, you can't speak. And also when you feel great gratitude, you also cannot speak. And we have the ability to see and know and understanding. And as our spiritual energy grows, these centers honestly light up much more powerfully than the Christmas trees. Brilliant light. It's almost like you're a miner with a big headlight on, and they become consistent. And it allows you to see into circumstances there. And at the top of the head, it's only love. It's only joy. The love in the heart turns into unbelievable, indescribable bliss, a fulfillment that is beyond really anything the normal person can imagine. This is where we are going as we expand our life. And so, without really trying, the touching and the energy centers on his hands begin to light up, begin to vibrate. And it was like tiny rivulets of life begin to flow into his head, into the areas that were damaged. And the sounds of the surrounding environment, the horse that was neighing here, the walking of individuals here, the carts creaking along with their wheels over the rock roadway, begin to come back into the perception of that child. And the pain that he felt really all over his head that was so severe that he didn't want to open his eyes began to dissipate. And he was healed. And he would continue to be healed for a little while, because this is the force and the love of life. It wasn't like Jesus was going, okay, now I'm going to heal you. Bang. No, no. It was a happening. If you saw the same situation, many of you would have come up to the children as well, because they were in the street stumbling along, hungry. They were beggars. And I've seen many beggars. It was very difficult for me in some of the areas that I've traveled to in the world, traumatized areas where little children would just come up to your car that was driving by and knock on the window and please. And we would obviously make our offerings. And so in a few minutes, he was better. Not only was the physical trauma that he had been through and the sorrow and the unhappiness from that event lifted, as if Jesus had come in very calmly and scooped that all out of their hearts, as if a great breeze had come by and washed it all away. This didn't take a lot of time. This was just a few minutes as he was passing by. But you see, most of the time we're in 16 different places. How often are we really 100% present here now? You're listening to this, perhaps you're eating a meal, somebody is. Somebody is listening to this and judging, oh, well, this can't be true. Somebody, perhaps they know me, because I'm part of a huge wave of individuals there in terms of what we're doing here in the global nonprofit activities. You know, there are tens and tens and tens and tens of millions of people involved. I'm not doing it. I'm just a person that is sharing a story right now, and also sharing a story of what I've passed through as well, because there are definitely parallels. And so what had happened really practically, aside from the healing, was the negative result of those past actions that he did. And he didn't even remember any of this. Obviously, it was another life of harming somebody. Jesus scooped that up and took that onto himself. The divine life really did. What had come in and joined with him for this limited period of time collected that. And it may sound superficial, but really he was amongst other things, a cosmic garbage collector of the trauma, the negative results. Karma can be both good and bad. The good that you've done is your merit in the past, and those that are not so positive, regardless if you think you're right or wrong, any action that results in harm to another person carries a penalty. Doesn't mean that we have to be weak, that we don't protect ourselves. If someone comes in to cause violence, of course, we have to step in and do something. Jesus is not what we call a pacifist. Remember the stories, or think about all the stories of him stepping in front. The woman at the well, the fighting that had gone on. Even one of his top devotees now was potentially being stoned, killed for accusations that were unproven, that it had relationships with somebody she wasn't married to. She wasn't married at all. It was very dangerous at that time. So even though the full story isn't there as recorded in the Bible, even though it passed through many translations, even though individuals wrote things in there that didn't happen and took things out that conflicted with their vision of what life was, the essence of the story is true. That a great being came into this world just like us as a child and had a task to do, to love and heal to take on to himself a heavy weight, you know, that divine life carries the weight of the entire universe. So there is nothing here that is overwhelming really to that. And he was joined with that during this period of time. So the principle of grace, the principle of spontaneous healing, the principle of one of the basic tenets of nature. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Unless grace and love of the divine steps in. And that generally is through a person. But the prayers that we have do provide relief. The prayers that we have do provide relief. And that divinity, whatever you choose to call it, is you. It's not somebody else. That is inherent in time and space, everywhere. So join me again. This is Dr. Jim Weldon from planet Earth. Sharing the greatest story and the story behind that story. How grace and love comes into this world again and again. And we're going to talk about everything that happened to him. We're also going to talk about what's happening now. And what has happened in the last several thousands of years. I'm not going to go through all of that. I would be creating these episodes every day for the rest of my life. Join us again, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what I'm shown, because I really don't know from day to day. Bye-bye.